To St. Luke from the 15th chapter. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. The Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So the father divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had, traveled to a distant country, and squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country. He began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating. No one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father, but while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But his father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one. Put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Get the fatted calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' They began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came in and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked him what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come. Your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you. I have never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given to me even a young goat, so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' His father said, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" This is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Reverend Dr. William Williman, retired bishop of the North Alabama Conference of the United Church of Christ and former dean of chapel at Duke University, noted in a sermon at the Festival of Homiletics several years ago that one of the things about being a lectionary preacher is, although you're sure about what you're preaching on week to week, month to month, year to year, on a 3-year cycle, it does sometimes seem like you just preached on this one last week. How can it be changed so that the perspective looks different? He said when he came to this set of scriptures, the ones we know as the parable of the prodigal son, he had preached from the father's viewpoint, from the son's viewpoint, from the elder's son's viewpoint, from the slave's viewpoint. He was trying to find a new one. So one year he preached at Duke Chapel, and a fellow professor from the Department of Religion walked out after worship and said, "Will, that's an interesting perspective of the prodigal son from the perspective of the fatted calf." There's a colleague of mine who has worked hard on a monologue speaking as the mother of the sons. A biblical theologian who is also a friend and colleague responded to her request for critique saying, "I think it's a great monologue, however, we as preachers are going to either preach on Scripture or we're not. And this is a parable, not a story about Beaver Cleaver and his family. There is no mother in the parable. And in fact, practically speaking, Dad might have had 2 wives or 3 wives, so that the elder and the younger might have had different mothers. It's just the way things work. We read that in Old Testament all the time. We read about one having child after child and one remaining barren, and how the one who remained barren believed she was cursed by God for something she had done. So he said, while it's a good model and a great message, it isn't about the parable of a man who had 2 sons. Now, almost all of us like to be the prodigal. You know, the one who went away. And in my family, every generation has one child who moves away. My mother's grandfather was the one in his generation who moved from Missouri to Colorado, became one of those gunslinging marshals. His son, my grandfather, was the one in his generation who moved from then Missouri to Nevada and did so many wonderful things as grandpas are wont to do. He drove a 4-up. For those of you who have driven horses, you know what that is. He drove an 8-up. He drove a stagecoach from Lovelock to Seven Troughs. He served in the Navy in 2 wars, and perhaps the coolest, at least according to those of us who are his grandchildren, he was a rattlesnake hunter. None of us ever got that skill. And in my generation, I am the one who moved away, far enough away to be called prodigal. Now, I didn't ask Mom and Dad to split the estate and give me my piece in a debit card or a credit card so that I could go away and gamble it or do other foolish things. After all, I was leaving Nevada, so I was leaving gambling behind. One of us always moves away and lives separately. distant enough so, and I will tell you, I got in a lot of trouble last week when I talked about my brother's heart attack, and it was just a heart attack, and I didn't rush out to spend time with him. Well, I didn't know he had a heart attack until he was already back to work, so I couldn't have been there. But that's when you live distant. He didn't want to bother me. So he told his wife, don't tell him until down the road. My parents told me 15 or 20 years ago that they wouldn't notify me until 2 weeks after the funeral when they passed away, so that I would not worry about it, stop what I'm doing, and rush out there. I would be busy with my call. And that's sort of how the prodigal gets a little out of touch, even though with tweeting and Skyping and emailing and instant messaging and Facebook and LinkedIn and on and on and on. Communication is relatively quick and easy. A lot of us want to be the prodigal. Not many of us want to be that grumpy older brother. Right? He's a jerk. I don't care if my younger brother, who I haven't seen for years, comes back and we're going to celebrate. I've been here the whole time and you're wasting my inheritance because remember, he took his. I don't want to be that guy. Now, I could throw out the rhetorical question, have you ever felt that way? But I won't, so pretend I didn't ask the question. Fred Craddock says parable is hyperbole. It's a story with a big point. What's the big point? The theological point is the Father is God. The brothers, whether they had one mother or two mothers and stepmothers, are the people of God. They are the church. What about the estate? The estate in the church is one of those things that ministers could spend months and months and months talking about. Is it that endowment fund? Don't touch my endowment fund. I ever tell you about Central Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana? I know I have, but pretend I never have. Once upon a time, less than 10 years ago, they had 10 people in worship. They had 30 people on the rolls. They had 10 people in worship on a Sunday. They had several $100 million in endowment. And most of that endowment was separated into a music-only endowment. So, every Wednesday, an organ recital. Several times a month, music recitals on Sunday afternoon. Nobody cared whether church was open Sunday. It had to be open Sunday afternoon because they were paying for this recital out of an endowment. Now those 10 people in worship, and I know some of them, they wanted to go and get some of that music money and spend it on evangelism. But you see, the guy who set it up was an attorney. He had that money about as locked down as an endowment could ever be. Don't touch my piece of the estate, he said, except for this. Not the way we like to be perceived, I don't think. But he got mad at the preacher one Sunday. The preacher was probably meddling. You know the difference, right? Preaching is when I'm preaching about them. Meddling is when I start preaching about you. The prodigal son can be seen as God dealing with the church and saying it doesn't matter where you stand on that issue of the stuff of the church. I once preached a sermon to bishops and to cardinals. And one came up to me post-sermon and said, "You knocked my socks off. That was a great sermon. I talked about me and Bobby Sherman, the other one, short, got a lot more hair than me. He and I drove the same year car. I told you that story, right? 1968. His was a midnight blue Rolls Royce. Mine was a powder blue Chevy pickup. When they were parked next to each other in the parking lot, I kept screwing up and trying to get into his car. He got mad because the door was always scratched, because my key wouldn't fit. Okay, I never did that. Thought about it, but never. I used that example as a perfect example of the church. There are lots who think the church should be that 68 pickup. It was a little beat up around the edges. It was, after all, a country boy's pickup. Might have been parked in Hollywood, but it came from the desert. Did not have to be polished up, and it was to be used. If the bed was scratched, oh well, it meant it had hauled something somebody needed. If the door got dinged, it was probably because it was in a less than appropriate neighborhood doing mission work. In fact, once I had it parked out front of my apartment in Los Angeles, actually Hollywood. And I came out and tried to start it and couldn't pop the hood. Somebody had come by and stolen my battery. Came back later this afternoon with a new battery. Joke was on them. The battery that was in there was so bad they brought it back. Bobby Sherman drove a midnight blue 1968 Rolls Royce. Nice car. I got to sit in the back seat and ride around several blocks. And when he got tired of that, he had a midnight blue 1968 Chevy. Polished all the time. Almost had to wear white gloves just to sit in it, let alone drive it. That's the church and worship. That's when the brass is polished and everything is set so that people can recognize the glory of God present in church. That's why those of us who, for lack of better words, are worship Nazis, we want worship to just be about as perfect as you can get it. Don't put fingerprints on the cross. It just takes away the gleam. I'm like that. I get here and walk through the sanctuary, make sure there isn't any dust hanging, making sure the fingerprints are wiped off. I probably put more fingerprints on, wiping off fingerprints that aren't there. Both of those are valid views, and in fact are important views of what the church is. And I think they are a perfect metaphor for a man who had two sons. There is the son who had a little trouble and wanted to go out and party hard. Wanted to be out among them. Now I wish he'd spend his money smarter. wish he hadn't spent it on stuff of silliness. But the point that I think Fred Craddock would say is in the Scripture is wherever we are in that picture of the church, wherever we are in the picture of life, as long as we are fair and honest and come before the one we call God with honesty and contrition, God says to those who have been in the church, thank you for being in the church. For those who have stepped away from the church, welcome home. Good and faithful servant. In the church, out of the church, where are we?